home causes shockwaves throughout Hollywood that it honestly never fully recovers from. It just kind of learns to adapt to. And let's have a look here. So first, we have to look at where the TV comes from. It, of course, starts being invented and used a little bit earlier than you might expect through kind of various inventions and experiments. But where we're really starting to get into things is, of course, the vacuum tube that has the It's time we talk about television. We've been dodging it long enough, but its influence on Hollywood and the way that it affects the film industry is immeasurable. This is another one of those before and after moments, like the arrival of sound would be to movies. And while it may not change the way movies are made to the degree or to the noticeable degree that sound did, television certainly affects the motion picture industry and the kinds of movies that are made, and there's no going back. And now we're even at the point where we're wondering to what degree the history of film is merely a setup for the longer history of television. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. First, we have to talk about its invention. So it appears maybe a little bit earlier than you might expect. And the real jumping off point would be Lee DeForest and Boris Rosing inventing vacuum and cathode ray tubes. These are in old-fashioned TVs before the days of flat screen. These would be the things that would actually make the display of the image possible. And so it's these inventions that would make the television itself possible. And then it's the experiments of people like DeForest and David Sarnoff, who also are going to experiment with radio waves as being transmitters for the television signal, because of course, remember, broadcast television, like radio, is initially over the air rather than a cable or satellite. And so we get in the 20s and 30s the beginnings of television stations, television broadcast licenses, and then culminating at the end of the 1930s, where you have a radio station, CBS, a radio network, deciding to begin developing television equipment and programming. And then RCA, the home appliance, creating a television set that they would then sell to homes eventually, but we're not there yet. These are some pictures from the Museum of Television, the Museum of the Moving Image in Queens, where all of those things in that picture on the right, those are all televisions. They might look like old-timey radios or like a radiator or something like that, but they are in fact early television sets from the 30s onward. And then you can see in the infographic on the left what the television looked like over time. It gets called the furniture with pictures, or the electric hearth, for the idea of how the American family would gather around the television set in order to like they would gather on the fireplace in the olden days. And so what you get in here with all of these different models of televisions is, Okay, so let's talk about how those various pieces of furniture with pictures on them, or the joke that some people made at the time, a toaster with pictures, what happens over the course of time? Well, as you can see here, just in one decade, just in the 1950s, this goes from being in roughly, 1 out of every 10 houses, so that's like one person on the block, to 86% of houses, nearly everyone on the block, having a television. What this means, of course, is that lots of people are able to watch TV at home and have the shared experience of watching one of 3 broadcast networks at a time. But if you are a movie studio, what this means is that your audience is increasingly dwindling. And in 1946, you saw the largest box office returns in history. And then now you're getting to the end of the 1950s, where suddenly people are able to watch stuff at home and are not going to the theater. Hollywood is in full-blown panic mode because, as you can see here, it is only about a 30-year time period where it goes from like nobody having these things to everyone having at least one of these things. That's the same amount of time from the Lumiere brothers to Birth of a Nation. In that time period, you go from having no competition to having a competitor in every single home, where they don't even have to leave the house to get something similar to what you deliver. So Hollywood's quaking. Now, they try to compete. At the time, in the 1950s, the color television set is virtually non-existent, at least for home use, and color broadcasting and things like that. So the way Hollywood responds is to get people out of their houses and not watching television, they had to give them something at the theater they could not get at home. So the number of films being photographed in color increases. It's not just going to be epics and musicals, it's going to be more and more types of films. What you also start to get here is that the early televisions in people's homes and the Academy aspect ratio of a movie, that 1.33 to 1, that 4:3 ratio, those are the same. So what Hollywood decides to do is, well, we have to change the way that the movies look to tell people that's better than what they are getting at home on television. So you get things like widescreen, CinemaScope, Cinerama, Todd AO, VistaVision, etc. All of these different competing widescreen formats that are trying to tell people, like, the pictures are bigger at the movie theater, right? Not only literally in terms of being projected onto a screen, but even the shape of the picture is a wider vista, a panoramic view, to make the television look like a boxy, limiting appliance, right? That there's no compare. You're also going to get films photographed in 70 millimeter, photographed in 65 millimeter, projected on 70. Of course, this is going to apply to bigger epics, bigger motion pictures. A lot of biblical epics are made in the 50s. Part of that might be something about what's going on in the country, but it's also like those sword and sandal epics of the 50s are mainly there to compete with television, right? Because television at the time is mostly giving you variety shows, live theater. They can't go on location and do the 10 Commandments, right? They can't do that. And so Hollywood is making bigger spectacle-driven pictures because that's the one thing they can do better than television can at the time. And this means you're going to have roadshow presentations where it's more like going to the theater. You're going to get a booklet. There's going to be an overture before the movie. There's going to be an intermission, all of that kind of stuff, right? This means these movies get way more expensive and flashier and, more luxe to try to draw people out. But it also means if they don't do well, the studio's losing a lot of money. And so that's sort of what happens in the 60s when these big bloated movies lead to some pretty depressing box office that further weakens the power that the studios have. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves there. They also try to do something like 3D. Now, 3D had existed in movies for a while, but in the golden age of 3D here, this is where you have the two strips of film, red and blue, kind of being projected together, where you have like the fancy glasses, the stereoscopic 3D vision. That's to try to get people to go out to the theater. But for a while, this was a problem because with the two different projectors, if the film breaks and you have to splice out a frame in one projector, it means you got to do it in the other one. Otherwise, it's going to get out of sync, and people are going to have their heads are going to explode watching it. But 3D had been around for a long time. It always comes back every time that there is a threat to the dominance of cinema. They always go back and say, "Hey, what if we try 3D?" You saw this in the past 10 or 15 years, when the streaming video and the internet were scaring Hollywood, they started to shoot movies in 3D or up-res them to 3D after they went into production, and give out, and upcharge you for the 3D version of the movie and so on. It's the same response that they had in the 50s to television. So all of these solutions that we're seeing now are really nothing new. It's all just what Hollywood does when it gets scared.